Hello everyone, my name is Fahed Rahman. I'm here with Poppy Knight.
Hello.
And on this episode of Audiobookish, we're going to be talking about True Crime Story by Joseph Knox. And I'll just read the blurb about True Crime Story. What happens to those girls that go missing? What happens to the Zoe Nolans of this world? In the early hours of Saturday, the 17th, 2011, Zoe Nolan, a 19-year-old Manchester University student, walked out of a party taking place in the shared accommodation where she'd been living for 3 months. She was never seen again. Blending fact and fiction, in his first standalone novel, Joseph Knox delivers a thrilling true crime story like no other. Do you want to introduce Joseph Knox?
So, Joseph Knox was born and raised in and around Stoke and Manchester, where he worked in bars and bookshops before moving to London. He runs, writes, and reads compulsively. His debut novel Sirens was a bestseller and has been translated into 18 languages. The Smiling Man and The Sleepwalker are the second and third books in the series. True Crime Story is a standalone novel.
Okay, so before we begin, thank you to Penguin Random House Audio for supplying us with the advanced review copy to this. So they sent us kind of a list of different books that we could review, and this was my choice. So yeah, it's not what I expected it to be, and it's really difficult to choose like a jumping off point to start the discussion because there's a lot in here. So I think a good place to start is just to begin with the format of the book. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. When I looked at the list, it was one that I wasn't necessarily super keen on because of that word true and true crime stuff. And I'm not a massive fan of true crime stuff. I don't watch any kind of, true crime documentaries and stuff like that. So I was worried about it because of that. But as will become clear certainly later on, that true is kind of a playing kind of true. So Zoe Nolan that you mentioned in the description is not an actual person, and a lot of the people in this are not actual people, but some of them are, some of the places are, some of the things are. So it is portraying itself as true when in fact it is fiction, which is really interesting and really fascinating. Definitely the kind of thing I would like. So had I known that initially, definitely would have been probably one of my picks as well. So yes, thank you for pointing it out and making me look a bit further than, than the title that seems scary. And I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that later. So kind of format-wise, it's incredible because it is done as Joseph Knox puts himself in the novel. It's one of those ones that I think is really cool where the author's kind of in it, but he's telling us that this book is mainly the work of someone else, a woman called Evelyn, who has been investigating the case of Zoe Nolan and has been interviewing as many people as she can, basically, to find out what has happened to her. And the book is structured as the evidence from those recordings. So kind of in physical form, you have them as transcripts, and we'll definitely be getting onto that as well. But kind of for us, it almost feels like the real recordings interspliced with emails between her and Joseph Knox. And there is also some intercisions of the publisher and things like that. So it's cobbled together, but in a very structured way of cobble. It's pulled together to bring the most exciting pieces at the right points. And flips between these different characters and people that have been interviewed.
Yes, I think you've given quite a good description of what it is. I think another way of looking at it is it's almost like an epistolary novel, kind of like Dracula, where you're not getting an omnipotent narrator telling you what the story is. It's very much through the accounts of other people, and with that comes whether those accounts are reliable, and whether you should trust the person who's providing you with that information. I read a really interesting review of this online where they said the novel kind of borrows the structure of a podcast. And I think that kind of hits the nail on the head. So I'm thinking about actually buying the physical book itself just to see if that's a different experience to what the audiobook experience is. Because for me, this works absolutely perfectly as an audiobook. It's kind of this is the format that the story is meant to be told in.
I get you.
Sort of thing. So yeah.
Oh, I totally agree. I think it is that thing of these recordings of people's spoken voice that then we're hearing in audio. So it even has like staticky noise that sounds like these were done on like a handheld recordery thing rather than in a professional audiobook
Yes,
recording booth.
exactly. Kind of that you
Yeah.
get that kind of tinny sound, and yeah, exactly.
It's so wonderful. And I also think just the fact that you have so many different people and so many different characters. I mean, it's just, we can all pretend we're amazing superhumans, but if you're reading that in a book, it's difficult to keep track. It really is. Like, one of the advantages of audiobooks, of TV and film, is that it's easier to remember which character's which, who said what, that kind of thing. The fact that you have these individual voices for these different people, I definitely think helps with the way that the book's structured, you know, to keep track of who's who said what.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And the other thing is that what adds to that is that the vocal performances are so good, and each of the voices themselves are really distinctive.
Yes.
And I think we'll talk a little bit more about the the superb performances in the audiobook a little bit later on. But it's a really interesting format. It's quite innovative, and
yeah,
I've certainly not read a book like this before, where it's really, I hate using that phrase postmodern, but it is really playing around with that, your expectations of
yes,
what a story like this is supposed to be and how it's supposed to be presented.
yeah,
And it's kind of, there's almost at points where it's commenting on itself as well. So
it.
it's really a fascinating listen that kind of gets your mind turning over as well.
Totally agree. Yeah, that idea of, you know, so many different perspectives and stuff like that you don't often get. You know, even if you get multiple perspectives, having this many is quite rare. And the interspersed with the emails and the flipping backwards and forwards of time. Yeah, that format is really exciting and experimental and really cool. And then all the meta stuff. Any consistent listeners will know that I love when things get meta. Is brilliant. And then also, kind of connected with that, this playing around of truth, what is real, what is not, is just amazing. In that sense, I have come across some stuff before that is really cool. So there's a book that I studied as part of my degree called His Bloody Project, which does the same thing of claiming to be true when actually it's not. So much so that there were people in the first seminar where we discussed it who genuinely learnt in that seminar that this wasn't true. So they'd read the whole book.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, it's fair enough because it claims to be, you know, you have the kind of beginning part, the prelude to it, that's talking about the author and how he went and researched this book, and it claims to be true but isn't. And that is a fantastic book. So if anyone listens to this and really loves it, then I definitely recommend that you try His Bloody Project as well. I didn't have it in audio, but there is an audio one. So yes, one of the great things that we looked at in the seminar was about where does the truth begin and end. And I think that's really interesting to think about this one as well. So we like looked at the physical book and was like, okay, is it, you know, is the front cover true? And things like it saying a novel on it, the tutor kind of gave away as, okay, so that is telling you it is fiction. You don't really call things novels if they're non-fiction. It's something different. So that novel is kind of a big standout thing of, we can believe this sort of thing, potentially. She was always questioning. And then kind of maybe the back page with stuff like the ISBN number and the price, that is true, that is written stuff. But where in the middle do the lines blur? And I find that really interesting with this one as well, because we have this is a novel by Joseph Knox is said at the beginning, and the credits of the people performing in it, which like we've talked about, and I think we'll have to do a deep dive into this, but the idea that the recordings sound like they're from the actual people, well, that can't quite sit with, well, you're telling me these actors have done it, so we'll definitely talk about that.
Yeah.
And then it has a publisher's note, and it's like, okay, well, is this true, is this not? Because publisher, that should be real, kind of, where does it blur in there kind of thing. And then at the end, you have a rounding up thing of, is this true? But then you have like, we hope you have enjoyed this Penguin audio production. And I think maybe, okay, that's where it ends. And it's really fascinating thinking of where the truth starts and where the truth ends. And yeah, which is what I at first looked at with His Bloody Project, and then doing it with this one, just fascinating.
Yeah, it's kind of like, this is a true story in the same way like the Fargo TV series are true stories, where kind of, basically each series of Fargo says this is a true story based on like factual events. Only the names of the characters involved have been changed to protect them in the future. And there's a little bit of that going on in True Crime Story in terms of it's saying that these are actually based on real events. The other thing, so I'm a big pro wrestling fan, and this might be a little bit of a stretch, but pro wrestling always considers itself to be real, even though we know it's not real. And there's a little bit of that going on with True Crime Story, where kind of it's telling you it's a true story, and that suspension of disbelief that it plays around with, I found was really, it was an amazing thing to kind of even attempt to do in order your book. And I think it really was almost completely successful. If someone had, because True Crime Story, a novel, to give its full title, if they'd left off the novel bit, I wouldn't been any of the wiser.
I get you. Yeah, I had to do a Google. I really had to do a Google.
I Googled Zoe Nolan's name as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad I did, because like I say, I was kind of put off by it. It's a theme that's touched on in the book, this idea of kind of how stories like this can kind of be glorified, and how it's an invasion of privacy for the people involved when things are in the media or documentaries and things like that. It is very much a theme in the book. It is something that is questioning. It's asking about our role within that. It's asking about authors' roles within that, journalists' roles within that, and stuff like that. And it is the kind of thing that, this is not in any way me saying I have the moral high ground, you're all glorifying terrible things happening. That's not what I'm saying. It's maybe even less than that. It's that I like escapism in my books. And so I don't like to think that this was a real person kind of thing, Yeah,
I completely agree with that. And I think, especially with the new wave of true crime podcasts, I'm thinking of My Favorite Murder, which I'm a massive fan of. I think that kind of, not glorifying necessarily serial killers, but I don't think feminist is the right word, but really understanding why people are telling these stories to themselves. And for a lot of women, they're looking at the thing that scares them a lot. And I think that's another interesting thing that's explored within the book, in terms of why, if the Zoe Nolan case was a real case, why she wasn't a bigger story than she was. So that's another thing that both Joseph Knox and Evelyn kind of play around with, in terms of, well, why wasn't this a bigger story? And they kind of, you need the perfect victim. And Zoe wasn't quite that. There was too many shadows and skeletons in her closet there.
Definitely. Yeah. It's so self-aware, this book, kind of knowing the part it's playing, the genre that it's coming into, the tropes of it, the moral questions around it and stuff like that. Definitely. And an interesting thing with that about bigger story, there is a massive thing in it about trying to drum up that media coverage, trying to keep her face in the media and stuff like that. And, all the people that are then stopped on the street because people have read about them in the newspaper kind of thing. So it sort of doesn't tell you much about nationally, but it certainly says that within the Manchester area, if you were there during those years, you would know this case. And so obviously that then would add difficulties if this were actually true. The twists, there are some amazing twists in this. This is one of the best things about it. It does twists really well. But they wouldn't work as well if you'd already read about it in the newspaper. So it's not something that's wishing it were true. It's something that's really playing around with that idea of truth. You reminded me when you were talking about the wrestling things and the Fargo one mainly. Just a funny story before we get into the deep darkness of True Crime Story. It was that I was quite young when we watched The Truman Show. Now, The Truman Show starts with, everything you're about to see is true. This has really happened. Okay? Now, little kid Poppy believes that because no one told her otherwise, okay?
Yeah.
So I watched the first, I don't know how long, but enough to realise that everyone in his life was actors and it was all a TV show, right? I ran away crying to my bedroom. My mum's like, what on earth is going on? Comes in, and it takes ages for her to realise why I'm so upset. But I was just like, how could anyone do this to a person? That's so horrible. And I had a little existential crisis in my bedroom. So maybe this is why I'm quite so I feel like we needed to straight away determine
Yeah.
that,
Is this actually happened?
true doesn't mean true.
Yeah. Well, true
So,
does not mean true, exactly. And I think that's another thing that goes through the novel. So I don't think I think we might have mentioned in past, this is basically essentially a full cast audio book. And I would just quite quickly just to mention the actors and performers in it. So Joseph Knox narrates a lot of the book. We've got Sarah Parks, Ciara Baxendale, David Johns, Chris Thompson, Louis Bernard, Drew Dillon, Shane Zaza, Caitlin Griffiths, Conor McLeod, Dolly Webb, Grace Cooper, Isla Lee, Levi Brown, and Noah Marullo. And all of their performances are really strong. And we kind of talked about in the His Dark Materials trilogy of how when you've got the writer doing the narration, it really helps with the intonation. But with Joseph Knox, he's playing a version of Joseph Knox as he narrates. So that's kind of another thing that he has to play around with. So that's presenting a version of yourself, narrating a book that you've written, I think is also adding another layer of things that you need to kind of think about as well.
Oh yeah, it's so messy and it's so juicy and I love it. He is this part of him that isn't a real him, but he's trying to convince people that it is, but he doesn't necessarily really want people to think that. And so it's really, really fascinating. And I also thought, because there's a lot of question within the book about him stealing Evelyn's work.
Yes.
By publishing it under his own name. And obviously this is kind of challenging these ideas of, okay, well, yeah, they've published it with Joseph Knox on the front. How does this play into what's true and what isn't? And I thought it was really interesting that the bits like where they introduce whose recording's coming next, that he's the one that does it. Because in theory, those parts were already compiled by Evelyn. And I thought it was a very interesting choice to have him say, and here's Jai Mahmood, for example, instead of it being the person who narrates Evelyn's emails. I thought that was a really interesting choice.
That's not something I'd actually thought about before. So yes, and there is a bit towards the end of the book where he's giving the acknowledgements and him trying to say, I've just kind of like put this work together. It's definitely all Evelyn's work, but that directional choice by the people that put the audiobook together is, that's
it challenges that, doesn't it?
It does challenge that a little bit as well. So before we get into the plot, I just do want to talk about the vocal performances a little bit.
Me too,
There's so much to talk about here. I've got like some e-notes. So I know you're a big fan of regional accents in audiobooks. So there's plenty of regional accents in there. So do you want to kind of talk about that a little bit?
Just this idea that you have so much range, it's just really nice. Even if you strip everything else away from it, it's really nice to be able to sit down for 14 hours and listen to a range of different voices. I really like it. I can appreciate maybe not everyone finds that so entertaining, but I think that's really cool. And one thing I did want to mention is that so Joseph Knox, narrating it, we spoke about how he's grown up around Stoke and Manchester. And I did think he's got a little bit of a Brian Cox about him in his accent. I feel like you can hear a bit of that in there.
Yeah. The wonders of the universe. Yeah. A little bit of that in there.
Yeah. I am notoriously, among friends and also work colleagues and family, don't like Brian Cox. But this is another kind of harking back to the Truman Show sort of situation. It's because, he's narrating something, he's like, and the world will end. And isn't it wonderful? And I'm like, no, it's not wonderful, Brian. Stop trying to destroy the world. So that's kind of where my hatred of Brian Cox comes from, is because he's far too happy about everything coming to an end. But I'm aware that many people love the sound of Brian Cox's voice. So maybe that's something that will entice you to listen to this audio. And because I can sometimes end up, mimicking accents that I hear a lot. And I was on a big binge of a big section of this, and then I went down and was talking to my mum, and I felt like I had a bit of Kim's intonation in my voice. Now I am from a similar part of the country, but even so I thought that was quite funny. And then you have Irish accents in there, you have Essex accents in there. It's range of accents is just fab.
I think it's a really great range of accents, and the only accent that really didn't work was when they had the French policeman on, and he struggled. Whoever did the voice of the French policeman, it almost went into Inspector Clouseau territory there a little bit. So that's the only weak vocal performance.
It took me out a little bit, yeah. I couldn't tell if it was, I don't know my French accents very well. I couldn't necessarily say that there isn't a French person that speaks like that, but yeah, my initial reaction, like you, was that it was maybe not the strongest French accent.
Yeah, so, yeah, definitely.
I was just going to say, I think all the performances were fabulous, and I really do think that they were all brilliant. But I just wanted to say, I thought one thing that was really nice about the audio was that I felt the narrator for Jai Mahmood really made himself sound so likeable.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree with you,
Yeah, and I think more so than... I think the words that he says do make you sympathise, and maybe not even, do make you connect with him. I think he does come across as a likeable person, but I think more so listening to it than if you read them in your own narrating voice, whatever. And there's a lot of things he's coming up against as to why people might have preconceived notions about him, things about drug use and homelessness that you could say in some senses trying to combat bad stereotypes that people might have of him, but you can't not like him. And I think you probably would still find him quite endearing reading it off the page, but certainly listening to him, he did a really good job of making Jai someone that you really feel for, but not in a patronizing way. You just feel like he's a really genuine guy.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I was going to mention this in my conclusion, but I'll say it now. It's kind of...
Oh, sorry.
The vocal performances here really elevate the material to another level. And
I think so.
Yeah, Jai's performance is one noteworthy one in terms of you kind of want him as your mate. He just sounds
Definitely,
like a nice guy. And I'm not too sure if I was reading the text off a page, I would have got that same sense off of him. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think his character's still well written and the stuff he says, but yeah, I think a lot of it came from that performance, for sure.
On the opposite end of that Levi is... I thought
exactly the same, mate. Exactly the same.
Hated her. Hated her so much. I knew, just kind of like that sort of I'm not, I'm not really a spiritual person or anything like that, and I don't really judge people. And then she'll say something absolutely horrific about someone. So and her performance. Oh God! The thing is, I grew up going to school with girls like that, so I was just kind of you horrible person.
And that's the thing where it's the performer, just like Jai, has done such a good job of portraying that character. But whereas Jai's kind of invokes, a really endearing response, that one invokes a "you're not my kind of person" kind of response. Yeah,
absolutely not. So we haven't really talked about the plot of the characters yet. So we've got Zoe Nolan. She's a 19-year-old girl. She has a twin called Kimberly Nolan, who I think a lot of the stories about Kimberly's relationship with her sister and her parents are Robert Nolan and Sally Nolan, and their kind of relationships with Levi, who is one of their flatmates, Andrew Flowers, who's essentially the love interest, Finton Murphy, and Jai Mahmood, who's Andrew's flatmate throughout the story. So we've got this rich cast of characters. And without going heavily into spoilers, it's really difficult to kind of talk about the character developments. But one of the interesting things, I think, to maybe start off the discussion of the plot is maybe talking a little bit about Kimberly's relationship with her sister Zoe.
Yeah, definitely. And just quickly before that, because it ties into those cast of characters, what I really liked about this book is that sometimes it feels like the person that we're after, the villain in it, the criminal, is someone that's inside that group, and sometimes it feels like it must be someone outside that group. And now, for spoiler reasons, I'm not going to tell you which one it is.
Yeah.
I think it flicks in the book. At times you think, oh, it's got to be one of them. And at times you think, nah, it's someone else that we've not heard about yet. And new names do come in. And I think that is a really, really good thing about this book, because sometimes crime can be a little bit like, oh, it's this closed group of suspects, and it's more like a game than it is like a real life story. And I think that's not a criticism of those ones that are more like a game, because a lot of the time we like crime stories because we like solving that puzzle, whereas with this presenting itself more as a true crime story, I like that it doesn't force itself into a really formulaic, well, here are all the possible suspects, which one do you think it is? It doesn't feel like that, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, I just to kind of quickly add to that, I think the messiness of real life people and the messiness of the situation is another theme that runs quite clearly all the way through the book, kind of the mess that people will leave behind and how you don't necessarily get a clear conclusion to situations like this as well. So yeah, I think we were going to talk about
Kim and Zoe. So their father had some professional music experience and very much wanting to live that through his children, and forcing them both to practice a ridiculous amount and a lot of methods that certainly sound really horrible. And Kimberly certainly positions it as she tried to escape from that, and others will position it as she just wasn't as talented. But basically what that ends up with is that Zoe is the musical hope, the musical protege, and perfect in everyone's eyes, especially her dad's, and Kimberly is the other one. And that's kind of the main balance of the relationship that goes through that, her tension with that, her tension of, can I not be an individual? You know, people always linking her with Zoe, but then linking her in a lower standing, but just the linking anyway was causing her troubles. And yeah, that messy relationship is what you have there with those two.
Yeah, and that's one of the key relationships at the heart of the story. So they both go to university together, and I think one of the central tensions in their relationship is that Zoe is this, you know, bright, beautiful young thing, and people gravitate towards her. And Kimberly's kind of like the, I don't want to say dowdy, but well, the way that it's narrated to us, the way it's told to us, she hasn't got that same light that Zoe has. So I think there's one line in the book where if boys had a choice between the two of them, and I do think they're near enough identical twins. They are identical twins. That, you know, if boys had a choice between the two of them, they'd always choose Zoe rather than Kimberly. And that, you know, as someone who's got two brothers that are a little bit more successful than me, I really understand that idea of kind of like sibling inferiority complex and how that can affect relationship dynamics as well. So that was a really interesting thing, and that damaged relationship makes people around Kimberly doubt what her role within her sister Zoe's disappearance was as well, which was a really, and you yourself, you know, as you're kind of listening to it, you're thinking, was she involved? Was she not involved? Is she telling the truth about this? So it's just setting up those little pieces.
Yeah, it's like you're saying, you can kind of have some sympathy with the position that she's put in there, but then obviously you're not condoning any sort of malicious intent coming from that. And it's not knowing if there is any. You know, she's quite forthright about how she feels, and she says that she feels like she has to be, because otherwise people are gonna assume things. You know, she's like, okay, well, if I'm really honest with you about stuff that I don't want to admit, stuff like I resented my sister, stuff like I felt worthless, then believe me when I'm saying that didn't turn me to doing terrible things. You know, I'll admit this horrible part of me that I'm ashamed of. I'm ashamed of this jealousy, but that is where it stops, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like Kimberly's entirely innocent. She makes some truly horrifically bad, poor choices, but those choices are kind of put into context a little bit. I mean, there's one particular thing that you know, that she does that's happens towards the end of the book, which I kind of think is really is a really bad decision that she makes there. But it's I don't want to give too many spoilers, but yeah, and that's what keeps the tension up as well, is that, you know, these characters that you, once you start to trust them, something's revealed about them that kind of makes you question that trust and the veracity of what they're doing and their motivations and things like that.
Yeah, what's really interesting with Kim is that we start with her and we start with an accusation that we can't trust her. So because the beginning chapter, rather than being about Zoe and her disappearance, is actually about a situation that Kim claims to have gone through. And you hear a lot of other people telling you that it's not true. Or you certainly hear some big voices telling you that it's not true. And people saying that she is a pathological liar and that she does that because of, you know, these,
she wants to seek attention. Yeah,
exactly. So you hear a lot of those things before you get to know her. And I think it's really interesting because of just the fact that the book is so focused on just that theme of truth. You know, there's also a mention of this pathological liar that was hanged in the past. You know, it brings that in because it's all about truth and lies. And so it's really interesting that that's how it starts it. But also this idea of, because it's a crime thing, who can you trust? Who is telling the truth? And, you know, you have to decide later on, are these things with new information coming to light? Are these things likely true? Are they likely not? And a lot of the time the book ends with, well, you still don't know for sure, but you've just got to make your own guess and assumption, which is obviously one of the reasons that we all love reading in books, isn't it? That we come to our own conclusions about stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And it must have taken him a really long time to structure the novel in terms of making sure, because it's kind of almost perfectly paced in terms of when he puts the twists and turns in there,
definitely.
I was going to say how he's put the dialogue together as well, kind of as if they were real interviews that he was splicing together.
Yes.
But yeah, it's kind of that, you know, pacing of like, the text, the actual key incidents that happen as well. I think is not masterful. Yeah.
Yeah, I made a note that, like, you really need some serious plotting in here. So because when Evelyn starts interviewing people, that actually overlaps with the span of the story. So you end up catching up. You get to a point where these characters that she's interviewing have already been interviewed by her, and they're talking about stuff that has happened since their first interviews and things like that. And the amount of, like, I don't know, post-it notes on the wall, Excel spreadsheets, however he writes, you know, that must have gone into working out when people knew what they knew and what people were feeling like in those moments when they were speaking in the other interviews and stuff like that is really cool. We don't have, like, timestamps of the interviews. Kind of Evelyn explains in an email that she has put them together thematically, you know, and kind of how conversations go. There's a really exciting part later on where it is properly played out like a conversation. So you might think that these kind of transcripts, just one side, can be quite limiting in what you're able to do. But we have this kind of simulation of a conversation, even though it's done through recordings, because you have Andrew says, oh, and then I said this, and then it cuts to Jai, and he's like, and then I said this, kind of thing, in a lot better way than I'm making it sound. Yeah. It flows really well. So yeah, those piecings together are awesome. And I think even the email correspondence is placed at really good points, and it's nice to have them as kind of a break from the tension, but also they add more tension. And yeah, cliffhanger's amazing, twists amazing, things come at perfect points. Yeah, totally agree.
It's actually kind of interesting. We haven't talked a lot about Evelyn. I think she is a really key character. She's the person that started this story, and she's got quite a, I'd say tragic, but she's gone through a lot of pain. She's a cancer survivor. She did have one successful book published, but her illness kind of took her out of publishing a little bit. And this book is her big attempt at getting back into publishing something that she thinks is really important. And her relationship with Joseph, in terms of, Joseph is someone she's looking to for support and advice, while still really staying quite self-reliant. And I love her. I didn't know if it's like a romantic relationship or if it's just kind of, she's the sort of person that likes to tease people. That came across a lot in the emails as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think, falling on that point, I took it as a kind of a teasy way, but it is definitely something to think about in the book as what their relationship is and is like. And it makes a comment on the world of publishing, so it's one of those books that's kind of, I am a writer, I'm trying to write. It talks about that kind of side of it. One thing that really stuck out and kind of you brought to my mind then was this idea that she talks about how her publishers told her to write a cancer book because she's survived this. And there's a real commentary on that idea of people getting pigeonholed and the way that they want books to be marketed and who's going to tell these stories, and how people get defined by one thing, whether it's one book that they've done, whether it's an event in their own life, their own experience, that kind of thing. I mean, I think you get it with all sorts of different people, in different areas of diversity, with things like sexuality and stuff like that, saying, you should be writing this kind of book. So it does a commentary on that. And then also another self-aware way in that Joseph kind of, can be a bit of a dick sometimes.
Yeah,
And like,
yeah,
she's saying, mate, this is my project. Why are you trying to muscle in on it? Kind of
yeah,
thing. And he, you know, he's written it, you know, he's presenting himself, although it is not fully true, in this kind of way of, I'm the more experienced writer, I can help you out, sort of interesting dynamic that goes on.
yeah. I think the other interesting thing about the dynamic, so I don't know if you took this from the vocal performance, but Evelyn to me very much sounded like a person of colour to
I
my
get you.
ears.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's also maybe a subtle commentary on how, you know, Joseph Knox is a cisgendered white male, and he's managed to publish
Take
this
this
book,
book.
and maybe take away credit from a woman of color. I don't know whether that's correct or not, because we don't get any physical descriptions of Evelyn, but yeah, that's just like, to my ears, that's what she kind of sounded like.
I totally get it, and that's definitely a very interesting thing to pull from it, that it's a commentary on that element specifically. I totally think that that's a fair thing to put on this book. Yeah, and it is definitely an issue to be commented on and stuff like that. On a slightly lighter note of that, I was kind of shocked when I heard Evelyn's voice, because she has quite a young voice, and I'm very sorry to any Evelyns out there. But I've always thought of Evelyn as quite an old name.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, she's young, okay. And I mean, that's the thing, if I'd read that on the page, it would have taken me a long time to think of her as young, I think, potentially.
Yes, especially with the cancer diagnosis as well, because that's typically something, it's an illness that, you know, predominantly strikes with older people, not, you know, exclusively, but
no, of course
with
not,
that as well. So let's talk about that, you know, the cast of characters a little bit more. So we've got Andrew Flowers, who is a rather unsympathetic posh boy, I guess is, you know, a good description of him. We've got Vinton Murphy, who's Zoe's friend. He's a gay lad that's come to university to kind of like try and live his best life. He's kind of had a very sheltered childhood in Ireland. We've got Levi, who's basically kind of like an Essex girl, and Jai Mahmood, who's, I think he's kind of grown up in the north of England, because I think he does talk a lot about how, you know, where he was raised, kind of the racial attitude that people in his area kind of had towards Asian people, kind of like dating white girls as well. So that's another thing that's brought up as well in the book, is the grooming scandals and things like that. So it's very good in terms of tying all these different strands together. So out of that bunch, which of those characters did you take to? Which ones kind of got your back up a little bit? I think you've already mentioned that you really kind of liked Jai's performance.
Definitely really took to Jai for sure. I think Lou, like, I didn't see her as particularly harmful, but not my kind of person, kind of is the vibes I got there. And I think she's kind of the main one that stayed, well, actually, those two are the ones that stayed static throughout. Whereas a lot of the other ones, my opinions of them fluctuated, I think. As we went, I kind of felt closer to them and further away. And, you know, even Posh Andrew, you know, there were times where I really did connect with him and sympathize with him, when certainly at the start I did not, but parts in the middle where I did. And yeah, I think everyone else I sort of fluctuated between liking, disliking, trusting and distrusting, certainly. Whereas, I don't know, those two kind of seemed pretty constant. What about you?
Yes, I basically, when I started listening to the audiobook, I didn't like any of the characters apart from Jai. I felt like Andrew, I just felt like, oh, you're just a privileged twat that, you know, he thinks he's better than everyone, enjoys being mean to people. Luai just reminded me a lot of girls that I kind of went to school with that I really didn't get on with.
Interesting, when she was homeschooled, that's kind of put as quite a big part in it. She's talking about like the competition between Kim and Zoe, and how with her not going to school, she didn't have the same sort of competition with other kids, kind of thing. But I think
that's, it's kind of interesting how that might have affected. And I just felt she had a really strange relationship with Zoe as well. In terms of, I don't know a lot about kind of female friendships, but that's, something about that kind of just struck me as a little bit single white female, if you know what I mean, that famous movie. Finton, I think my feelings with him fluctuated the most, because the vocal performance just gave him an air of
like authority, wasn't it?
Yeah, there's like he's like overly officious, if you know what I mean. It's kind of like a jumped up bureaucrat kind of air to him. But then his, you go from sympathizing with him quite a bit to disliking him quite a lot as well, and then kind of coming back up again. What particularly struck me was his talking about his relationship with his mentally ill mother and kind of some of the things that he went through there. I found quite touching. But yes, it's all the characters I kind of started off disliking, then I kind of wavered in between liking and disliking them as well.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting there is this idea of, are we hearing the real people or are these recreations? So, before I'd kind of properly dug down into this, where do I think the truth starts and ends bit, I'd obviously heard the cast list. And so I was thinking it as a kind of okay, well, they're admitting that these are actors. So maybe what we're meant to be thinking is that these are recreations of the recordings, okay? But then with the staticky noise, and stuff like that, it's definitely meant to seem like it is actually real. These are the actual recordings from there. And then, okay, does the credits messy that up at all? Or do we say that they're a different part? But then there's a point where, I don't think this is too spoilery, but there is a point where apparently the tapes get wiped.
Yeah.
And so then that challenges this truth idea in the audio.
Oh, yes, of course. Of course it does, yeah.
Yeah, in transcript, it's absolutely fine. But in audio, okay, well, how does this work? So there was a lot of time where I was kind of like, who are these? Are these the actual real people? Or are these, like in crime recreations, which is actually in the book as well, are these actors playing these people? And where does that line go? And found that really interesting. But then there was a part with... so there's a really cool bit of this trying to make it true idea where it claims that this book is a second edition of the first book, so that it can have things about the response to the publication. And Fahed mentioned that in the synopsis part of it. And in that you have, and here's Jai Mahmood reading his Facebook post from after the thing came out. So then you're like, okay, well, this is definitely meant to be actually Jai's voice. And so that's all fascinating. But then obviously Evelyn, also not really a spoiler because he does say it very early on, but Evelyn is no longer with us. And these were emails, not recordings. So who's her voice? Is this meant to be an actor's voice? Presumably, because she didn't read out her emails. And I thought that was really interesting and messy. Obviously, it wasn't written for audio, but I sort of feel like we're coming to a point, hopefully, or this is what we're working towards, when like every format that people can read and access stories in, it's meant to feel like this is what it was made for, that like everyone should get the same experience no matter what, or the same level of experience. It shouldn't feel like you're getting a version of the actual book, if you get me.
See, I slightly disagree with you there. I think the beauty of something like this in audio is that it does give you a different version of the story.
I think different, yes.
Yeah, the experience I had listening to this, I think would have been vastly different to actually reading the book.
Yeah, and now that's what I mean. What I mean is that the audio should stand alone as an amazing audiobook, and not like it is the read out loud version of this printed book. You know? So like how a lot of things feel really tied to that. I think the only way it, I guess, can fail on that is there was a picture attachment in one of the emails.
Yeah.
Obviously we can't
see that.
But apart from that, yes, I completely agree with you. I think it's been completely elevated. But that's why sort of part of me wants it to be neatened up. I want answers as to, are these meant to be the actual people or are they meant to be recreations? Like, I want it to feel like you thought about this and made it for the audio. But then equally, I love the messiness. I love the fact that it's kept me up thinking, okay, well, that person could be actually them and that's not. And maybe they just found the tapes again somewhere and they weren't wiped. And getting creative with that in my brain. I loved how messy that was.
I kind of like the messiness of it, to be honest with you. Yeah, and there's so much to talk about. We've already kind of mentioned how it's kind of a genuinely original mystery. We've talked about the sibling rivalry.
I want to talk definitely about the music and the sound. Okay.
Oh yes. So, that's not something I'd made note of, but go ahead.
Oh, it's so good. So the music that starts off at the very beginning it's really awesome, creepy music. Is no better way to describe it. I think it is very much like a detective TV show intro music, which I think is a very good thing. It really reminded me of that. I could totally see, TV credits coming in that kind of a way. I also really love how they use it overlapping some of the big twists or cliffhangers.
Yes.
That really builds the tension, how they've weaved that in there. They've not just done, okay, at the beginning of the audiobook and at the end of the audiobook. It's sort of an end of episode kind of feeling, but overlapping with those vocals of what the twist is.
There's one particular bit with Jai Mahmood where they do that really effectively. And it's just like, ooh,
I know, exactly.
What's going to happen here?
Oh, definitely. It is so, so good. And yeah, the atmosphere it makes, brilliant. Timing that they've used it of, and just the genuine composition, just brilliant.
Yeah, it's absolutely magnificent, yeah.
Mm-hmm, totally. And then, so sound effects, we've talked about the kind of staticiness, but also with the emails, okay? You have a little notification sound. You have like a sent email noise and you have a new email noise, which are
and
both
the typing
really good.
as well as she's narrating.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. You also have, so he's redacted some parts of the emails and you have like a censor beep, if someone swears kind of thing. Oh, and also just going back to those notification sounds, there's one part later on where they very cleverly play about with the timing. So often you get sent noise and then pretty much immediately you get email arrived noise. And then when the tension's ramping up, there's a bit later where you get sent noise.
Yeah.
Email arrive noise, and it's like, I was shaking at that point.
Yeah, I think it does go to say that Penguin have absolutely been banging out some absolutely great audiobook adaptations, and you're thinking of the work they did with 2000 AD. They're really, people in the industry talk about how there's a lot of innovation going on with the production of audiobooks. I think there's a lot of interesting directorial choices that they've made here.
Definitely. And a similar way, but actually on the writing rather than the audio, is I thought it was really interesting the way he's pieced it together with, so someone will maybe make an accusation or bring up a new fact or piece of information, and then the person that it concerns, we don't hear from them again for ages. They don't get to defend themselves for ages, a lot of the time, not always. Yeah. And I found that really helped with the tension as well, because you want to hear them defend themselves. You want to hear what's going on, but instead you're hearing loads of other people coming up with what they think about it. And I thought that was really clever as well for tension and timing of, keeping you waiting on what isn't really truth, but you feel like you want to know their side of the story.
Yeah, it's actually quite remarkable. This is only his, I think, fourth book, because it shows an assuredness and skill.
Yes.
To put that together is so difficult. So, congratulations to him. There are only two other things that I really want to talk about. So the first one is basically about Manchester and kind of using that old cliche, the city as a character, but especially the tower block. They live in this kind of dilapidated, brutalist tower of student housing, and how that really in my head became this character. And I was just wondering, it says true crime story, but the weird things that happen within that building, are there kind of a supernatural element to it as well, and kind of the way that the city and the culture of character of Manchester is kind of portrayed through, because there's not a lot of descriptions of the city of Manchester just by the way the different people behave within it, and how you kind of get a sense of what the city is like through the way that the people behave as well.
Yeah, I mean, so just quickly on Manchester wise, I quite liked being taken back to the Trafford Centre, where because I live in Newcastle now, but I grew up in Preston, and we went to the Trafford Centre a decent amount, and it was kind of a nice nostalgic thing for me personally going back to there. But definitely about the tower. And I'll be honest, it made me glad that I'm listening to this now and not the summer before I go to uni. Because if I was moving into student halls straight after this, I would be shitting myself. Like, I was very glad that I have done that. I've lived in student halls before now being told this terrifying story set in student halls. That was what I thought. And I mean, and this is a thing of just how good and gripping it is, but like I was listening to it and then I was just gonna go outside and was walking through the streets, and I didn't want to listen to it in the dark walking through the streets. These are very safe streets, and I know no one's gonna get me, but it's so spooky that in a really effective, like I'm properly bigging it up kind of way, that meant I didn't want to listen to it in the dark outside.
I think that's absolutely fair comment. yeah, there were certain bits that I might have. Usually, when I'm listening to audiobooks, depending on the book, I usually listen to it 2 times speed. This one, most of it, I listened to at the speed that it was intended to be played at. That there were a few little bits there where I think I just needed to fast forward it.
Oh, really?
just to get through, just to get to the other side, especially when it kind of things ramp up towards the end. I had to force myself that no, actually slow down. This is not a McDonald's meal. Enjoy kind of like the that feeling inside your belly that this audiobook is kind of creating and kind of so that's the other thing as well. And it has one of the most genuinely creepy, horrible visuals I could possibly imagine involving
you messaged me about it.
involving a mannequin, and I won't say any more than that. But when I listened to that bit, I was just like, oh my god, that's horrible.
For the listeners, I with out of the blue, no mention, I got shocked face emoji, vomiting emoji, the mannequin bit in True Crime Story was the message I got from Fred. Which was very funny. But yes, I agree. Very spooky moment. And he's done really good writing to do all that. I think maybe slight criticism, but I took myself in and out of it. So I kind of felt sometimes that some parts of it were almost a bit too well written to be someone's casual spoken recorded conversation.
Yes, it's kind of the Joss Whedon effect a little bit, kind of these really well articulated teenage people. But I do get that as well.
I felt like they were really well written. It was really poetic. It was really clever. Loads of metaphors in there. If it was written, like you say, with an omniscient narrator, I'd be perfect. Great, good on you. But I almost felt like people were being a bit too philosophical, and that kind of took me out a little bit, and like explaining their own images and metaphors a bit too much, where kind of I prefer explanations myself. But then, like with the philosophical thing, I think they talk about it. They talk about the fact that they've been living in this situation for like 7 years, I think it is, mulling over everything in their minds, trying to figure it out for themselves. So in that case, I sort of flip back on it and go, you know what, actually, they probably have come up with all these metaphors themselves because they're trying to explain it to themselves. They're trying to make sense of it. So in that case, it sort of did, it did flip back to, this does seem right, this does seem real kind of thing. I think what it comes down to is that, like, it seems like they're all psychoanalyzing each other. And I think it's just that because of either listeners or readers, we're used to doing that of characters ourselves. We're used to making those judgments. And so it feels a bit strange to hear other people doing that for us. That's not necessarily bad or a good thing. But for me, I just had to jostle with that, I think, myself. But then equally, on that same vein, it was interesting then when you have Joseph's emails where he is doing our job of, as a reader/listener, analysing the characters and thinking who is the baddie, who is the goodie. And so it was interesting then. It's like you're in your own little book club with him, talking about who you're suspecting at this point and what's going on in it and where she should be leading her investigation next and stuff like that. It was really interesting.
Yes, I mean, it's kind of interesting what you mentioned about the characters psychoanalyzing each other. And I think that didn't strike me as odd because a lot of the psychoanalysis was criticisms of other characters. And I felt that was quite natural. I know when I'm kind of bad-mouthing someone, I will kind of like go into, well, he's doing this and I don't really understand why he's doing this, but I think it might be because of this thing. And I think that kind of backbiting came across more naturally to me. But I do take your point, and it's something for me to think about there as well.
You make a very good point there, I think, because one of the examples that stick in my head is kind of like, it was probably Lou Y again.
Lou Y. Saying, that's the person I was thinking.
Saying that, Kim was acting like this because she's jealous of Zoe. And we've talked about how their relationship is such a big theme in the book. And I guess part of me felt like it was like, I know that. It should be a bit more subtle than that. We all know how themes in books work and character motivations and stuff like that. Like, stop making it so obvious to me. It was just how I felt at some moments. But then equally, I think, like you say, it does fit with what the characters would be saying, and that kind of works. One thing, again, that I had to kind of backtrack on was that I made a note when I was listening that I felt like a mention of, I think it was like Andrew says that Zoe would have changed her relationship status to "it's complicated." He doesn't say it like that. That was me putting that emphasis on. But I found that really cringy, and I was like, oh, it's like someone's writing it as "what would kids say" kind of thing is how it came across. But I actually kind of have to backtrack on that. I still think that bit's cringe. But the way that he uses Facebook and the internet later on is really effective. This idea that it's a place for cyberbullying and for invading privacy, and what you have as public information and what is private information, and how technology can be used abusively and stuff, was actually really, really fascinating, and a way to really well modernize crime stories and bring them into what are genuine fears that people have at the moment about how kind of social medias and stuff can be used in that way.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to pick up on in the book?
I think it's another one of those ones where we could go on for ages, but we probably shouldn't. And then maybe I can talk about most of my stuff that I have left in a sort of summing up sort of way. So I, as a bit of a personal note, I love crime stuff. As we talked about, I don't really go for true crime stuff, but like detective things and cop shows and crime shows, I love. And I'm saying shows because it's interesting. When people ask like favorite genres, I always list crime quite highly up there. But the fact of it is, I haven't read or listened to all that many crime books. Some, definitely some. But my love of crime comes mostly from TV shows and things. When I was younger, we watched so many. At any one time, we would usually have about 3 different crime shows on the go at once, and it really are my bread and butter of stories. I'm always a big believer that, you know, reading and books and stuff like that, it's not so different from film and TV and all sorts of different mediums. It's stories. It's all about stories. And yeah, TV crime is definitely my background of that, and something that I absolutely love. And I think this did feel a lot like a lot of my favourite shows. It reminded me quite a bit of the DCI Banks shows, which I really love. And I've also read some of the books of those as well. And yeah, I would recommend this if you like crime, like me, whether that's reading it, listening to it, or watching it. I think if you like that genre, I recommend it as a really good example of that genre. But it is a genre that can be very formulaic, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Often we like reading or watching or listening to the same kind of thing, but with a different criminal, a different victim, a slightly different situation. And that formulaicness is often really good. It's something I really like about the genre. But this isn't one of those. This isn't just another one that could be like any other one, but it's just one of the top tier ones. It isn't that. It is something different because of, like Fahad said, this experimentation with the format, with how well Penguin has done this audio version, and with this obsession with truth as a theme and the way it messes about with stuff like that. It's super messy, it's super grippy, it's quite dark. I would
say it's very dark.
It's very dark. Yes, I'll give you that. We haven't watched as many crime shows recently. I think it's more kind of just how we are as a family at the moment, that we don't need quite those dark things in our lives right now. But I loved it in this book. But if you are, like I was a few years ago, really deep in your detective shows and stuff, then you will love this. But equally, you want something experimental and exciting, you will really love it. So yes, I think do be careful if you're not ready to face very dark themes and issues. But if you are, and you like crime, it's amazing. It's super gripping, twists, cliffhangers. It's super messy. It's super interesting. Really well done. Yeah. What about you? What's your recommendation?
Yeah, I kind of echoing what you say there. I can't recommend this enough. I think I might be edging towards saying this might be my audiobook of the year. I like it. I really like it that much. I think what Joseph has done in terms of the storytelling is really, really good. You know, like you, I'm quite a big fan of crime shows, police procedurals, that sort of thing. Yeah. What really hooked me with this was it just felt like a really good true crime podcast, even though it is just a crime story. It's not, you know, it's not based on anything that's actually happened. And, you know, that idea of playing around with a format that's kind of quite well trodden in terms of, you know, the true crime podcast, and mixing that with a fictional story. I think he just gels it perfectly. And I think it's a well executed story with compelling characters, great twists, and fantastic performances. And kind of what else do you want?
Yeah.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Cool. So I think that's 2 thumbs up from both of us. I think The Carpet People, I think, is up next.
Yeah, I think we're going to do that one next. We have another book that Penguin are giving us some proofs for, but we're waiting on those. So I think we're going Carpet People next.
Yeah, when we're not turning into a Penguin audiobook review podcast, it's just this is just kind of how it's
turned out. Yeah,
how it's turned out for this season. We might have a couple of author interviews coming up, and just keep your ears and eyes open on social media for that. And guys, thank you for listening, and please follow us on social media.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let us know what you thought of True Crime Story. We'd love to talk more about it.
Yeah, please get in touch either. I don't think I've mentioned the podcast email. So if you do want to get in touch with us and you're not on social media, the email of the podcast is, as I quickly look it up on my laptop, is audiobookishpod@gmail.com. So if you're not on Instagram or Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook, you can email us there.
Yep, awesome.
Okay, guys, thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.